worked because we got a gym and a shower here. And when I came back from the Jackson Festival last week, I came back with a hell of a cold. So basically the past week all I've done is eat and sleep. So I'm going to go for a run now. On the plus side, I switched to sugar-free Red Bull. It's got to be worth something, right? So the way I see it, I'm well on my way to becoming an Irish step dancer. Right, that's enough of that. I'm going to go defunk, and then we're going to talk about something that I've been putting off for a couple of years, learning music by ear. So strap in. I get this question a lot. Anytime I post a video about a tune, a lot of times people are asking, do you learn this by ear? Do you learn it from sheet music? Is it okay to learn from sheet music? What about tabs? A lot of those types of questions. And I've just kind of put it off for so long because it's sort of like an abstract idea about learning by ear. But I've got a couple of ideas I think might help, hopefully, steer you along the way of learning by ear, because I think it's a better way to go. So let's get a couple preliminaries out of the way. First of all, if you play with sheet music, if you use sheet music, if you can read it, and it helps you, is that a problem? Is there anything wrong with that? No, absolutely not. If it helps, that's great. I mean, the O'Neill's collection, for example, is kind of the Bible of Irish traditional music. It's a bunch of great settings of a bunch of great tunes that probably don't get recorded that much anymore. You can find some absolute gold digging through sheet music if you can read it. I will say there's a couple of caveats to playing and learning by sheet music. For me personally, if I have to learn a tune, particularly if it's something that somebody wrote, you know, a new tune that there aren't any recordings of, and they just give me sheet music, I can learn it, I can pick my way through it, and it's fine, but I've always found it takes me a lot longer to make it my own. You know, I don't put in the ornaments as well, or as interestingly, I can't really come up with any variations on it. I just kind of get locked into the page. That's the problem that I've seen when learning with sheet music, or that's a problem. The other issue, the bigger issue to me, is you can find some kind of questionable settings. Now again, O'Neill's, some of those classical, like the Willie Clancy book, those are all great. You know those settings are legit and they're going to be well played. But if you go on to like the session.org, look, I can pull up a tune here. Let me just, if I just look for, so I just pulled up the Bucks of Oranmore, right? And I'm going down here and I can see that right off the bat, it says there's 13 settings of this tune. And you've got your sheet music and you just keep going. There's just a million settings. They're just everywhere. Look at all this. So that's one trick. How do you know which one to pick? Because the problem that you're going to run into is you might end up picking one that the rest of the session folks don't play. It might still be a perfectly legitimate setting, but if your goal is to be able to play with people in your community, that's going to be an issue. The other problem, the more serious problem, is that you may not know where these settings come from. They may not even be very accurate. If you get to a session and you play a tune like that and people are kind of looking at you a little weird and they're going to ask you, hey, where'd you get that setting? And if you respond with, well, it was the session.org setting number 9, that's not going to go over very well. Now, the last caveat, and this is a must, under no circumstances do you bring sheet music to a session. Now, there are a couple that will allow it or occasionally even recommend it. Those are few and far between, and that really is a crutch, because the end of the story is you have to memorize these things. Whether you learn them by ear, whether you learn them by sheet music, you got to memorize them. So if you're going to learn by ear, there's a couple of things you can do to kind of simplify the process, hopefully. So the first thing, the main thing, find common themes. Playing Irish music, a lot of times you hear the old joke that they all sound the same. All the tunes sound the same. Well, it's not entirely true, but there is an element of truth to that. And the reason is because there's a lot of these repeating patterns that show up in multiple tunes. As you're sitting there listening to it, whether it's at a session, whether it's a recording, start listening for some of those common patterns. What do I mean? Well, a common one is an arpeggio. And so if you don't know what an arpeggio is, it's basically a triad jumping up a chord. So that's an arpeggio. And it's really common in jigs because of that whole triplet triad relationship. So for example, a tune called Leslie's March. Simple arpeggio. Same kind of thing, a tune in G, a tune called Hand Me Hamilton's. Right, same thing. And then another tune in D, Kitty Lie Over. Right, same kind of thing. The next one I'm going to say is it's what I'm just calling runs. Basically running up a scale. There's a couple of good E minor tunes, Ross Commonreel, I think. like run. Basically just runs up the scale starting on an E, goes up to the B. Same kind of thing in the tune called Golden Keyboard. Same thing. The only difference is it's got a roll in the middle, but it's the same idea, just kind of jumping up the scale. D reels have a ton of commonality. There's all sorts of little, little simple phrases that you can do. There's one called Miss Monaghan's. That little blurb there kind of dances around the E in that case. Same kind of thing on a tune called Launching the Boat. Same little kind of phrase where it just bounces around the main note. Like I said, particularly common in D reels, although those things show up just about everywhere. So keep an ear out for those things too. This one I'm just calling repeating bass notes. It doesn't really have a very good name for it. I don't know what else to call it, but it just kind of bounces around a main note. So if you've got a tune like Lady Anne Montgomery, let's say, right, so all you're doing is bouncing off that low D, kind of like a bass note. That's why I call it repeating bass line. Galway Rambler, so same thing. Different key, different notes, but again, same idea. Let's say Fair Molasses. Right, same idea. Just bouncing off that low E is kind of the bass note. The last phrase I would say to look out for is what I'm calling repeating rolls. And all that really is if you've got two dotted quarter notes back to back. So like say Silver Spear. Again, just back to back dotted quarter notes. Same thing with Spike Island Lasses. I did a video on that a while ago, the B part. All it is, dotted quarter notes back to back. Key G, Primrose Lass. It just starts out the phrase that way. So again, if you can keep in mind some of these common phrases, repeating lines, all this kind of stuff, it'll just help break down the tune, because you're probably going to find a couple of those in just about every tune there is, which is going to bring me nicely, I think, to the second point, the second trick, if we're calling it that, which is break these tunes down. You want to find a phrase and find the start and the end of it. That's a great place to start, and then all you have to do is, in that case, is piece in the middle. Have you ever seen that thing? It's some sort of study at Cambridge or something like that, where if the letters are all jumbled up at the start, here, like, look at here, check. See, you can read this whole thing, which is, I don't know, kind of cool. I think of it the same way. I don't know, maybe that's dumb, but to me, I think of breaking down tunes the same way. If you can get the start and the beginning of a phrase, then all you have to do is find out what the middle parts are. So, like, if you can identify a phrase that starts on a D and ends on an A, so, and those are your starting and end notes of that little phrase, then how do we get there? Does it go beyond the A? Does it go up, like, say, so where it jumps beyond it? You can usually, figure that out. Or does it stay within that whole range? So, if you can get the start and the end, you can kind of fill in the blanks and hopefully break that whole tune down in chunks. And the last thing I want to talk about is perfect pitch versus relative pitch versus something I'm calling instrument pitch. It's not a thing. I'll come back to that at the end here. If you've got perfect pitch, it can definitely be an asset. I don't. When I was young, I was taking piano lessons, and I did a lot of ear training, and eventually I was able to have them bong a note, and I said, oh, that's a B flat. But I wasn't ever particularly good at it, and it definitely didn't come natural to me. It can also be an interesting disadvantage, as I found out. A friend of mine who plays Irish music, and we were listening to the band Dervish in the car. They play everything half step sharp, and it completely messed with her mind why you'd be playing sharp like that. They just do it because it sounds cool, and the fingering's the same. So if you're playing a D flute, you do the same thing on an E flat flute, you've now played it a half step sharp. But to someone with perfect pitch, they're going to end up learning those tunes in what are effectively the wrong keys. Pluses and minuses with that. Definitely not a requirement, though. Relative pitch, as I understand it anyway, is the ability to discern intervals. The distance from whatever note that you have in your head, whether it's middle C, whether it's A440, and then you can identify what that pitch is just based on intervals. The smaller, lesser version of that, I would say would definitely apply in Irish music, because again, as I was talking about breaking down parts of tunes, if you find that a phrase starts on a D and goes to an A, well, that's a fifth. Knowing those intervals will help. Again, I wouldn't say it's something you have to have, But it is kind of a part of learning tunes by ear, is being able to identify the intervals. Well, did we just jump up the octave there? Did they go to a fifth? That'll help. It'll just help save a lot of time when it comes to learning these tunes, if you have at least some concept of intervals and a bit of that kind of ear training. Now, what I'm calling instrument pitch may be specific to flute, whistle, pipes, things that are conical board like this, things that have kind of the same fundamental physics as these instruments. I'm not sure if this applies to accordions or to fiddles, things like that. I really don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were some similarities. Now, when I say instrument pitch, what I'm talking about is each note on the flute, the whistle, the pipes has its own tone, its own characteristics. And I don't mean pitch, because obviously the pitch changes, but a bottom D on a flute sounds different than a bottom E. Again, not just because it's a step sharper, the actual quality, the tone of that note is different for each one. I don't know if this is just me. I've never really had this kind of conversation with anybody, so please let me know in the comments if this makes any sense to anybody. But when I'm listening to a recording of, say, just fiddle, it takes me a lot longer to figure out what it is that they're playing as opposed to a flute recording or whistle or pipes, because I'm not so much learning the notes based on what the pitches are, I'm learning the notes based on how the resonance of the instrument is, because each note is fundamentally different. Different length, different resonance amount, different bore dimensions as it gets narrower towards the end. The holes are all different sizes, so each note has its own characteristic. And it's the same across any instrument. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that every flute sounds like every other flute or every whistle sounds like every other whistle. I've done videos on the compare and contrast on those, so that's not what I mean. But there are some fundamental physics-type characteristics to these instruments that when you overlay, say, a different type of wood, or in the case of a whistle, different type of metal, it's sort of like putting a filter over a photograph or some video footage. The underlying data, I know that sounds kind of weird talking about music, but the underlying sound of the instrument, the physical characteristics, are the same no matter how you build the thing. Within reason, obviously it's got to be in tune, it's got to be playable, but assuming good quality instrument makers, and you're assuming that the instrument is well built, they're all going to have those same kind of resonance characteristics. What changes is that maybe some of it's a little bit brighter using a different type of wood or a different type of metal. So that's the cool thing about these instruments, is that if you spend a lot of time listening, you can start to understand just those minute differences between each note. Like, to me, each note has a word that associates with it. So like the bottom D, I always think of as strong or biting. E is a bit more mellow. F sharp, strong, because that hole, I assume, is larger on the F sharp. G is bright. A is brighter. B is weak. C sharp, I don't really have a good word for that, but I know it when I hear it. It's just that kind of strange association that each note has its own character, and you start to listen for that when you're listening to tunes. So see if that applies to you. You may have already experienced that. If so, please do let me know. I'd love to know if anybody else hears it the same way as I do. If you haven't, you probably will if you can spend a lot of time listening to flute, whistles, whatever it is that you're playing, even if it's not flute or whistle that I'm teaching here. If you can spend a lot of time listening to that particular instrument, you can probably start to pick out a lot of those characteristics, and ultimately that'll make learning tunes by ear a heck of a lot easier. I think so anyway. Hope you guys dig this. I'll see you all in the next one. Cheers.